Wonderful to be here. What I would like to do this morning is to speak with you about the interactions between humans and AI in order to find a way to move beyond the frame that you too often hear, I think, about AI being in the place of humans. AI somehow replacing human capacities, even taking away our jobs. I think the real issue, as many people are discovering now, is how AI is changing our society, changing how we think, changing how we do work. And the real ethics is not about where we should and where we should not have AI, but more about how we can have AI installed in our society in a good and in some kind of a responsible way. So that's what I would like to explore. And that brings me, I think, maybe to the main topic that I want to address today, with big words, the future of the human mind. I'm not somehow pretending that I can really make a prediction about the future of the human mind, but I think this is typically how we should think about artificial intelligence. And I always like to go back in history to understand what current technologies are doing. And if you then think about our mind, our thinking, our own cognition, then it's good to realize that technologies have also, in earlier times, changed and affected how we think. The interesting thing is the first philosophical texts we still have, of course, come from the time that people started to write. And the philosophers of those days were as conservative as they're often nowadays. People like Plato were really worried about writing, because they were fearing that we would lose our memories. We would never be able to memorize things as well as people could do in those days. And Plato was also quite neurotic about his own ideas, because he felt that then other people could just read what he had thought and they could get their own ideas, and he would not be there himself to explain what he really meant, or his people around him. And of course what he did was to foresee the culture that we are living in now, a culture of texts where you have schools of interpretation, where we do have a memory, but a different one. Much of our memory is now externalized in our bookshelves, etc. The press, printing press, maybe in a sense, was the next technological revolution of the human mind, where suddenly texts could be multiplied, and where knowledge was not locked up in monasteries for the elite within the elite that had access to knowledge, could copy it, etc. But suddenly there was a democratization of knowledge. It could spread around the world. And no science without the press. And reading glasses, you could add. And people of my age could not even be able to read all those texts anymore. And so technologies have changed our minds before. And I think this frame can help us to understand what AI is doing. How will AI affect how we understand, how we think, how we have views of the world around us, and therefore also how we do our work. So if you then think about the role of AI in societal domains, I think the most important question is how to understand the kind of influence it has and what's at stake there. And so if you think about law, of course there's a lot of talk about algorithms helping judges to reach a verdict. And where people fear that at some point the AI might do the work of the judge, and how can we ever check if they're doing the right thing, etc. Of course, that could be a real worry if we would indeed somehow start to rely so much on AI that we think, okay, the algorithms will be better than the humans. But the real question is, of course, how can a judge take responsibility for the verdicts that she reaches with the help of AI? And that's where all the ethical ideas about AI come in. How can AI be explainable and somewhat transparent? How can you be accountable for the choices you make with AI? And that's even more sensitive in the field of healthcare. Here's a picture of a Twente professor who does really exciting work in neurotechnologies. So he's also a medical doctor at the hospital in Twente, neurophysiology, and he also has a company making very sensitive sensors to detect the activities in the brain. And what he's doing is working on AI that can help to make a prediction about the condition in which people could wake up from a coma, which is very important information, because some people would wake up in a very nasty state and would probably not even want to be woken up. But it also means that this algorithm helps doctors to make choices about life and death. From very good intentions, of course. It's important that we have this stuff, but it's also quite something to let AI help us make choices about life and death. How can we do that in a good and in a responsible way? And how can we move beyond the frame that now we will start to rely on AI and AI will choose whether or not we can live? And that's maybe the frame that we need to move away from. Most importantly, AI typically plays a role in our material world. I will say a bit more about that. We live in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, where the information technology is not just about information on a screen, where we are an avatar in Second Life or something, but information technology becomes physical. The internet becomes an internet of things, and AI is embodied in a robot, in a body, you could say. And also there you see a lot of talk about replacement. So many people shiver when they see a picture like this, saying, okay, if we have many elderly people who cannot even eat anymore, this is not a patient, by the way, this is a Japanese minister of, of health. So he can still eat, but people feel, should we deal with elderly people like this? Should we let the robots feed them rather than have human care with compassion, etc.? And that's typically the frame that you see. To make it personal, my own father, at the end of his life, was not able to eat anymore. And when I first saw this robot, I thought, wow, he would have loved this. I mean, he hated the fact that he had become like a baby, where my mother, my sister, myself, or one neighbor had to feed him. If we were not there, he would just not eat. He found it too humiliating. So you can also understand a technology like this as a technology to, embed values in healthcare, like dignified illness or something, and see if you can integrate technologies like this in a practice of care. In our design lab, we even made an extra AI addition to this, because some people cannot even operate it anymore with their chin. And then we asked them how they felt about having to be fed, and what they hated most was actually the fact that they then had to eat alone, that they would miss the social moment. So people wrote an algorithm, a very basic one, that follows the conversation at the table, and as soon as it feels that a pause is coming up, it gives a bit of food to the patient. Very basic, but it enables you to eat in a group again. Well, that's maybe an example of a frame that can help us to move beyond. Oh, sorry. This is what I wanted to show as the horror image of the feeding robot that we sometimes have in mind, but this is what I want to move beyond. And the idea that we would all be replaced. The real question is, how does AI enter our society? How does it change our society? How does it change the way we understand the world, our way of thinking, our minds, and how we organize our society? People in Japan call this Society 5.0, the fifth society that we are entering after the fourth industrial revolution. An interesting frame, a bit deterministic maybe regarding new technologies, but the idea is at some point we changed from a society of hunter-gatherers to an agrarian society because of a technical innovation, which was the plow, which enabled us to live on one place, to re-fertilize the soil. And a long time later, the steam engine was invented, leading to the industrial society, the computer to the information society, and now the fourth revolution to the digital society, Society 5.0, which means that, well, the infrastructure of the way in which we organize our world is changing. We should not take it too deterministically. Of course, there are humans as well who, well, give meaning to technologies, etc. But actually, it is an interesting frame, I think. It's maybe even a bit along the lines of Marx. Not that I want you all to be Marxists. I'm not a Marxist, actually. But his ideas about the steam engine, about the first industrial revolution, were basically also like this. He really saw that this new technology would change society radically. That we would have new, economic means, that factories are expensive, you need to borrow money, and then of course you need to pay back that, and that means that you have to have large amounts of production, much more than your own village would need, and that actually the pace of production goes up, and that the laborers have to follow the pace of the machine, and that in the end actually we become the slaves of our machines rather than the machines being our slaves, right? Well, we've learned to deal with the steam engine, and not everywhere in the world, maybe, but we have learned to live life in an industrial society. So now the question is, I think, how can we live life well in Society 5.0? First of all, that means, I think, that we have a better understanding of how technology works on us. Where does it affect us? Because earlier generations of technology, before the fourth revolution, were still technologies that we could typically use. You pick them up, you put them away again. You're a human user, a subject with your freedom, your intentions, and the technology is an object that you can use. It's neutral, it's an instrument. And that gives a lot of power and autonomy to the human being. But technologies of the fourth revolution are not just technologies that we use. They start to merge with our environment. The Internet of Things, sensors installed everywhere in our material world, where suddenly things are not what they used to be. They are active, they understand us, they work on us, and even influence our choices. And within the field of marketing, there are a lot of examples. Philips making shopping windows with eye tracking and based on theories of neuromarketing. The idea is you walk along a shopping window, you look 2 milliseconds longer at that one jacket, and then the theory of neuromarketing says that you do not yet know that you want to buy the jacket, but the brain already knows it. So the shopping window helps the brain a little bit, sheds a bit more light on the jacket. You think, hey, that's a nice jacket, and you buy it, right? Autonomy, in a sense, becomes a problematic concept there. Still, we make a choice, but the infrastructure from which we make a choice is changing. And those are maybe the real implications of AI. On the other hand, technologies merge with our bodies, not only with our environment. An implant in the brain that helps Parkinson's patients to walk again has a lot of implications also on your mood. People are even working now at the university where I work on implantable AI, microchips in nanochips in rats, which enable rats to do basic calculations. And so that's, I mean, do you use these technologies? No, they also use you. It's a new merger, you could say, between humans and technologies. Technologies also add this extra layer of information. AI is also in a lot of augmented reality, where you see the world through HoloLens, Google Glass, whatever, and at the same time you see information about that world. So you get an interpretive framework with the technology that you use, giving us an entirely new way of being in that world around us. Interacting with a robot, also interacting in a different way with the technology than we could ever do. It's not just like getting money from an ATM or something. The technology perceives you as well, and you start to be aware of the ways in which the technology responds to you. So we have to develop some kind of a mutual understanding of each other in that sense. And maybe the most important thing is actually what we end up doing is cooperating with a technology. Expert systems are often framed as alternatives to the human, where the real expertise is in the system. But what in fact happens is that both the system and the human have a relation with the world. And the interaction between the human user and the system, that's the real thing to be aware of and to design somehow. If an expert system advises a medical doctor about a diagnosis, of course the doctor also sees the patient. And the real challenge is obviously for people who design this software, how to help the doctor to make a good diagnosis. Which of course is a challenge, because how could the doctor possibly go against the algorithm if the algorithm can oversee so much? That is simply not possible for the human mind, but that's the trick, to be able to understand the expertise of the algorithm, as it were, so that you can add your own expertise to that. This means that Society 5.0 is a disruptive society. Well, at least technologies are disruptive, but I don't mean disruptive in this negative sense of everything will break down. It means it's a radical change. And we have to see it as a radical change. And I think that's also why you see this explosion of ethical frameworks about AI. 2019 will go into history as the year of the ethics of AI, I think. Basically, any organization wrote some kind of an ethical code, always coming down to the same basic principles, small variations, but it shows that we really feel that we have to do something. And so maybe just an example of how the disruption works, but then at the level of how we have to understand the world around us. Maybe you've heard, it's also maybe kind of a funny example, but in Saudi Arabia they gave personhood to a robot, Sophia, a very human-like robot, and they gave her, personhood in that society. Well, as soon as you start to do that, as soon as you start to blur the boundaries between humans and robots, of course you make a lot of mess in our concepts in ethics, because persons are agents, they have agency. Does a robot have agency? Well, in a sense, it does. It has a form of autonomy, which we typically associate with agency. Can it be responsible for its actions? Maybe somehow, because it can reflect on the actions, but it was taught to do so by humans. So where's the real agency here? It's not only in the humans, but it's not only in the robot either. So agency comes with responsibilities. So can a robot, by means of deep learning, develop an own sense of responsibility? Or is it only executing the tasks that it was given by humans? No, it is not only doing that. It learns on the fly. So how can we still work with the notion of human responsibility in an age of robotization? Persons have human rights. So should we move into the direction of robot rights? People are saying that. So if robots become so important in our society, shouldn't we respect them? Or is that absurd? Well, it sounds absurd, but I'm doing a bit of work with a Japanese professor who designs robots that can feel pain. He designs them in such a way that they learn not by developing concepts about the world, but by developing like a baby, like a child that has basically the stimuli of things that feel good and things that hurt. And by doing so, it develops its understanding of the world. So these robots feel pain, whatever that might mean for a robot. If you go that route, of course, at some point the question pops up, should we put limits to that? Or is that too weird? It is not a weird question. Well, persons are part of a democracy. What role could AI play in our democracy? You can go on forever. Blurring the boundaries between humans and technologies, that's what we are doing. AI can do things that in the past only humans could do, and that urges us to rethink very fundamental concepts with which we organize our society. Society 5.0 requires a fundamental rethinking of the basic ideas that support the functioning of our society. Maybe that's also the reason why we seem to be somehow obsessed with the demarcation between humans and devices. What's the difference? What makes us still human? As if we are looking in the mirror of technology and we really start to ask ourselves, if AI is so smart, what makes us smarter then? Are we still better, or are we actually being taken over? Should we feel humble? So the basic question here then is indeed the mind, the way of thinking. The way of thinking of AI seems to outsmart us in a sense. That's why we have the two thinkers here. So the funny thing is AI, of course, also started with the basic test, the Turing test, to see how human-like a system could be. Where in the Turing test, the system is behind a wall. You interact with the system or with the human, you just don't know. But if the interaction feels natural and the system is a computer, then the computer passes the test. And it's a good example of AI. We seem to be way beyond that. First of all, we are exposed to kind of a reverse Turing test ourselves. We have to prove that we are not a robot if we are online. It's interesting, and we have to prove it by solving stupid puzzles that then actually also help the algorithms to do their deep learning. But in this movie, Ex Machina, maybe some of you saw it, this is really taken to the extreme in a very nice way, in the sense that here the Turing test changes towards a test where the system is not behind the wall, but you just interact with the system. This artificially intelligent robot, woman, Eva is her name, for good reasons. The movie, if you look at it, is full of religion. Is this the new Eve? Is this the beginning of a new humankind, a post-humankind or something? And the Turing test is now that this guy has to be in a room with her for a week and has to see if after that week he can still see it as a machine. Can he switch her off, or will that become murder? It will become a Frankenstein story. I will not give you all the details. I'll say a bit more about Frankenstein later. But I think this is maybe the point that we have reached here, of course, in a movie with a lot of fiction. But the question has popped up: how human are these robots, and how much should we take them seriously as humans? I think the fear that they will take our jobs is some kind of xenophobia that you often see in the radical change in our society. It's like what some, how do you say that nicely? Some parties, how they see immigrants. It's alien people coming in our society and disrupting everything that felt so good, and now suddenly we have to deal with them. This is, I think, the fear of job loss also. It shows how human-like robots have become for us. Yeah. Maybe one last example of the demarcation, the uncanny valley, which you must all be familiar with somehow. And that, one of the most important things in robotics is to design robots in such a way that they don't look too much like a human, because then they really enter the realm of the zombies that we find scary. So you can have a nice toy that moves a bit, and it's cute, a bear that can interact with you. But as soon as you see a corpse that suddenly moves, then that's really scary. And in that realm, robots can be really scary. There is some kind of a deep need in us to demarcate ourselves from the robot. Let me check how much time I still have. 5 minutes, okay, then I'll go really fast. Frankenstein is maybe a very good example to deal with that tension between humans and technologies. Where in the story of Frankenstein, of course, the same thing happened. Victor Frankenstein built a quasi-human being out of corpses then. The lightning flashed into that body and it started to move. And his first words were, now I know what it feels like to be God. But then suddenly it really started to move, and then he was so scared that he ran away and he let it all by itself. It walked into the world without speaking the language, without being able to do anything. And Frankenstein just forgot to educate it, to help it be integrated in our society. If you read the story more carefully, that is really what the story is about. The monster is quite capable of living a decent life, but after a while he feels so lonely. Everybody hates him, everybody finds him ugly and scary, and then he comes back to his maker and says, yeah, you have to do one thing for me, make me a wife. And the first reaction is, okay, reasonable. But then he thinks, okay, wait a minute, if I do that, maybe they get children, and I'm really at the beginning of a new species. Can I do that? No, better not. So suddenly the ethics is there, and then he says no. And then the monster says, okay, well, if I have to be lonely, then you have to be lonely too. And then he starts killing everybody around him, and then it becomes the horror story that we all know. But basically the story is about how to educate technology in a good way. So what does that teach us about the ethics of AI and about dealing with AI in Society 5.0? First of all, we have to move beyond this idea. The idea that humans and technologies are opposed to each other, and actually we should see ethics as some kind of a boundary between humans and technologies, and setting limits, having the principles there with Kant in your hand saying that's wrong and that's right. We should see technologies actually, I already went further than I wanted, as a basis for our thinking. The funny thing is, we are really scared about technologies that are coming in the future, but if we look at our past, we actually try to understand how people before us lived by looking at those very old stuff, old things that they used. The hand axe tells us about the kind of life that people lived in the age of the hand axe. And I think that's a very good thing to be aware of. Technologies help to shape our life, help to shape Society 5.0. So what we have to do is to understand that by moving beyond this opposition and seeing technologies as some kind of a medium in which we live, a medium that connects us to the world around us, that helps to shape therefore how we behave, how we act, how we think, how we understand the world, how we organize practices in our society, how our democracy functions. Technology is like the water in which the fish are swimming, helping to shape also how they can swim, how they can communicate somehow. It's not opposed to us. It is us, and it's the medium in which we live. We've come to see this human-technology world relation in our group as some kind of a lemniscate. With a little bit of philosophy. In philosophy you have the Hermeneutic Circle. It's a mouthful, but it's basically a model to understand interpretation. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretations. The Hermeneutic Circle goes between humans and the world, saying that if you make an understanding of the world, then the world changes for you. But that also gives you a new role in that world, so you change as well. And you become an observer, and the moon becomes a heavenly object or something if you use a telescope to look at the moon. And so the two shape each other. And a technology typically is in between that circle. So we have to interpret the technology for it to help us understand the world, and that gives the technology a new role in that world, changing us as well. I think that's a model that can help us to understand AI. If we use AI in mental health care, and also something that we are working on now a little bit in our design lab, for instance, using an algorithm in your smartphone to analyze your voice, not what you say, but how you say it, now seems to be able to make a prediction 2 weeks beforehand if people with a manic form of depression, how do you call it, bipolar disorder, and 2 weeks in advance it can tell you, hey, you speak differently, your voice sounds differently, different pattern in your breathing, you might run into a manic episode. And then, of course, that's very important, because as soon as you're in it, you feel overcourageous, you think, I don't need my medication anymore, and before you know it, it runs out of hand. So it's very important that we do this. So this is an example of that hermeneutic landscape. So the patients will interpret their own disease in a different way, the medical doctors, the nurses as well, but we also have to learn to integrate that technology in our society, in our understanding of ourselves. It has an interpretation of the world. It analyzes our voice. Yeah? So there is a bit of mind in there, but it also changes our mind. And the art of dealing with that is to see that as a landscape, to see that we also have to make sense of the technology. That's our responsibility, to do the appropriation of the technology. It's not only about how we design the technology in an ethical way, but also how we appropriate it in a good way. But you can tell that story for many other things. I will speed up a little bit because I think my time is almost up. In education, I will not go into the details, but this is actually one of my kids a few years ago. I'm a colleague, Vanessa Evers, who has a child on the same school, where we did an experiment with robots in that school. Also, how robots are engaged in education does a lot with how kids understand the material that they have to use. Also, how they understand the teacher, what the role of the teacher is. This is thinking about AI as mediators. Voice assistants. What do voice assistants do with interpersonal communication? Why are they almost always female? And why do they take all the insults that we give them? There's actually a lot of gender research on this very topic. It's amazing what people shout at these voice assistants and how much gender bias there is in that. So will this ultimately somehow trickle down in the human sphere? And if so, how can we take responsibility for that? Well, of course, we have the world of fake news, where the media help us to understand the world around us, and we also have to learn to deal with AI, with the algorithms behind journalism, behind Twitter, behind your newsfeed, and develop forms of literacy to be a citizen in this technical society. It means, and then I will come to an end, that ethics should not just be about the question, should we or should we not have AI? Ethics is about how to accompany AI into our society. We've made a little model, a very basic model, just to do that. You can also download it from my site, so you don't need to. And so studying the technology in its very context is the most important thing. Don't have these detached ethical ideas, but study it in the context and then see how it affects people, which values are at stake. So you start bottom up. You don't start with top-down principles, but the values in healthcare and education. And as soon as you know them, try to see how you can implement them in the design of technology, take them seriously in the implementation of technology, and also help people to use technologies in some kind of a critical way from the perspective of these values. I hope that can help a bit to expand the ethical discussion on AI. And maybe you've been speaking about this yesterday. There is a big discussion on the ethics of AI in which the EU tries to take the lead, which I like, but also dislike, I must say. The frame is there's a race going on between America and China, and the race is typically an economic race, and the EU wants to win the race by making ethical AI. And of course, there is a point in it. So the idea is, in the US, all your data are owned by big companies that make a lot of money with your data. In China, all your data are owned by the state that steers your behavior with the data. Why can't we have democratic AI or something? AI based on the European values. An interesting story, but the problem of the story is, A, that it's some kind of a race with winners and losers, whereas actually I think the human mind is at stake, the entire humankind is at stake. The southern part of the world is not on this picture at all. So what about Africa? What about South America? And basically, what we should do, I think, is to find a framework that is uniting the world somehow. So that's to end with my role at UNESCO. That's why we are working now on a worldwide ethical recommendations. That's maybe the real breaking news. Not that I'm chairing that Commission, but within UNESCO there's also now an ad hoc expert group working on a recommendation, so kind of a legally binding normative instrument for all member states on the ethics of AI. And I think today or maybe tomorrow the composition of that team will be made open, and I'm happy to be one of them. I really feel that as a privilege and also a specific responsibility to bring in this worldwide inclusive view on AI. How can we design AI in such a way that we take responsibility for the human mind, for human thinking, and to enable everyone to be part of the worldwide society? I hope we can make that work. Thank you very much.